Hello, everybody, and welcome to On Air episode 24. Today, we are joined by artist, research theorist, and professor at UCSD, Brett Stalbaum. Described as a serial collaborator, Brett has started and worked on an innumerable number of projects that use technology and the internet to investigate and expose different systems in our society. I definitely recommend checking out Brett's projects because they're absolutely fascinating and brilliant. I think personally. Over the last decade, the internet and technology has really drastically changed our way of life. And in the last couple of months, it has shown us, or maybe forced us more to understand and explore the possibilities that the internet provides. But that's true with understanding all systems and the possibilities of the future of those systems. It's always really important to understand its history and the development. So today we have Brett, who will share more with us about the history of art and technology as it pertains to the internet. So if you have questions for Brett for after, leave them in the Q&A section and we will ask them. Brett, now over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much, and it's really lovely to join you guys today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen first to get that out of the way. Okay, and then, you know, the important things first. I hope everybody is well. I hope everybody's in a safe place and feeling good and taking good care of yourselves. It's a it's a frightening moment in the United States in particular, with COVID-19 sort of spiraling out of control. So I hope everybody's well and safe and taking good care of yourselves. It's also very important right now, to realize the implications of the Black Lives Matter movement, to remember people that are being murdered by police, and to I don't know, continue the process. There's something that all of us can do as artists and as people, and with our neighbors. To hold, in my case, to hold my white neighbors accountable is something that I'm interested in. To hold myself accountable is something that's becoming, the importance of which is becoming more and more clear on a day-to-day basis. So again, I hope everybody's well out there. These are historic times that we're living through, and the things that I'm going to talk about, sort of the history of the internet and internet art, are not the most important things at this moment. But hopefully it's a little bit of a escape for all of us too, for those who need it. So I'm going to start today by raising the question: what happened to our internet, right? What happened? This is a famous cartoon from the 1990s. It was very, very funny at the time. Maybe less obvious today in the era of Zoom, but on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And one of the things that this refers back to was a very, very different experience of using the internet in the early days. This is actually published about 2 years after I first got online. I'm almost 30 years as an internet user at this point. And this was published in 1993. And the internet of that era was largely text-based with a few pictures. It was barely capable of transmitting images even. It was a slower internet. And so, this was very, very funny during that era. Based on the idea that, on the internet, nobody knew who you were. There was a sort of built-in anonymity, and a sense of wonder. That's, here's another funny cartoon, Timothy Lockley. On the internet, now on Facebook, everybody knows you're a dog. So something has happened to our internet. It's changed in this period of time, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today, and then examine some of the really important works from the 1990s in terms of internet art. This, I think we do have time to take a look at it. not an intentionally or explicitly art site from the 1990s. This is Hamster Dance. It reflects an era of the internet where amateurs could, explore, where the code was relatively accessible for beginning programmers and beginning designers, and that people could do goofy, silly, but nevertheless delightful things in the form of a website. So hamsterdance.org, actually really one of the famous websites of the 1990s. And what happened to that kind of whimsical, you know, exploratory kind of internet in the meantime? Down here. So this is sort of the era that we live in right now. Internet stunned, Geraldo Rivera tweets semi-nude photo of himself. Warning, you will not be able to unsee this. So trigger warning, right? Look away if you don't want to see a Geraldo Rivera tweet that you can't unsee. That's what happened to our internet. And I want to really explore like how we got from, the delightful novelty of the early internet to this. So that lets us talk a little bit about the internet at the present time, sort of the notion of feeds and silos. And this is much discussed, I think well understood by everybody who's been paying any attention, is that, the internet of today is, organized into these tall vertical silos and really silos inside of silos. We all have feeds that are controlled by an algorithm, typically artificial intelligence, that organizes the world that we experience for us, our Facebook feed, our Twitter feed, our Instagram feed, etc. And it's also allowed, enabled, a new generation of, nation state on nation state meddling in each other's affairs. In the United States, we would be most closely attuned to the 2016 American election as an example of, the spread of misinformation. Bill Gates mentioned recently, he actually sort of blames Facebook to some degree for the spread of coronavirus in the United States because it enables these silos of misinformation to exist kind of unchecked with information from the outside world. So we've gone from some kind of open and free and diverse internet and receded into our silos at this point in history. So I want to talk about some of the things that were, and I'm not making a case for today's internet or the former internet. I'm really just here to to educate maybe a little bit about what the old internet was like, talk about some of the projects and art ideas that happened there, and then look forward to some kind of the future emerging technologies maybe a little bit. Here's another way to look at our present reality. There's a notion of the data body that's really important in critical studies. Going back to a group called Critical Art Ensemble, who did a lot to theorize what the data body is, but it's really our existence in databases and as an information distributed around our economy in various ways. There's a link here. We don't have time to go through it. It's just about from CNN in 2012 about the sort of terrible conditions that Amazon workers and Amazon warehouses work with, and sort of their cybernization, how the human body is becoming kind of computerized to be more productive. So it is extending into the human body, but it also exists out in cyberspace and in almost any way. I mean, obviously in all of these consensual ways that we're very aware of, Facebook, Google+, Instagram, WhatsApp, Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, all the places where we buy our stuff. There are other kinds of consensual silos that people enter into, things like Tinder and Grindr and Christian Mingle, which are just different audiences for exactly the same thing in most ways. And then there are all these kinds of mandatory or unavoidable silos that we get stuffed into. We can talk about, state level surveillance, the U.S. National Security Agency among them, who collect data about everybody who's online and database it, store it, mine it. Just our basic participation in the economy, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, our government records, including things like the DMV, but also things that are quasi-mandatory that we have to become involved with to be involved in the society. Banks are a really good example of that. Would any of us trade the convenience of banking to be unbanked in order to preserve our privacy? Medical and rental, et cetera. And there's some things that are kind of quasi in the middle of the Venn diagram. And many times to get a job, you have to become involved in these social media sites. So there is a certain degree to which being involved in the economy involves being involved in social media. So, our data body is wide and distributed now, that sort of digital version of us that lives out there on the internet. And one of the ways to think about this is a sort of relationship between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. And these are things that we teach in much more detail UC San Diego in the ICAM major and other majors in the visual arts department, where students learn a lot of these technologies, especially computer programming technologies, in very sophisticated ways. But I'll just talk about them in kind of general terms that may make some sense to the older among us. And this, what the internet was like in the 1990s, the Web 1.0 version of the internet, which began to sort of disintegrate around, 2002 to 2005, in my estimation. Maybe some of the younger among you won't realize or won't necessarily immediately understand what the internet was like in its early days. So in the early days of the web was made of pages, and those pages were linked together via simple hyperlinks. So you click on a link and you go to another page. A lot of the experience of using the internet at that time was much more interconnected, in that the early experimenters with the internet would freely post links to other websites on their website. And a website was a collection of pages. So we could also talk about websites or web locations as being under the domain name. And early in my experience with the internet, I would click around the internet, and this was really the nature of using the internet. Even the earliest very famous web index, Yahoo, that later became a company and mostly disappeared, was really a collection of links that you could search, and then you could wander around and look at different things. And again, I can't really emphasize this enough, is that websites would have links to other websites, and trust me, you can't find on Amazon a link to a competitor, right? When you enter Amazon today, we're in the Amazon silo. So this is a way of saying that surfing the internet in the 1990s, you would see maybe hundreds of domain names per week as you looked around. And now the way that we tend to use the internet is much more in these large sort of corporate silos, where the address in your web browser might say Google, or it might say Amazon, or it might say Zappos, or it might say, but the number of domains that we visit today, this is just my experience, are notably less. And we go there for business and sustenance and sociality, and to be bought and sold as products, have our data bodies sort of prostituted around the internet. And in the 1990s, it was a really, really different situation. Hundreds of websites, far fewer services, especially in the early internet. There was no way to really order anything, for example. It wasn't a commercial hub yet. We had an interconnected web versus the silos of today, which is very different. It's reflected in the names of the popular browsers. The most popular browser of the 1990s was Navigator. Built into the name is this notion that you're traveling on the internet and visiting different places, versus what's Chrome? What does Chrome mean? It's a marketing word for a piece of software. In the 90s, we used hypertext markup language. Now, don't, you know, it, you could hear in my talk today sort of and I don't want to be too nostalgic about what HTML was compared to HTML5 of today. Um, because, technology does increase, improve, become more sophisticated and complicated. It requires higher levels of professionalization over time. That's kind of a natural trajectory. But, in the HTML of the 1990s, really all it could do was link up different pages. And you could visit one page and then another page and then another page. Whereas today we're looking at apps. When you visit a URL like Amazon.com, you're really using Amazon's web app service, and it's not a page anymore. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that other than to say HTML5, which exists today. I mean, it's still a markup language, but there are a couple of other enabling technologies that make web development significantly more difficult than it was in the 1990s as well. To be a web designer in the 1990s, you just learned HTML and some graphics tools and cobbled pages together. Now, websites really are a combination of these markup languages, document object model, which is a way of keeping a document in the browser's memory with hooks to it so you can change aspects of that document to make an interactive kind of document. And that's really what I mean by the transition from a page to sort of interactive documents. JavaScript enabled all of this kind of interaction on a single page, again, now an app. Server-side communication and client-side communication used to be fairly simple. Now it's all and more obvious. As you move from one page to another page, you could look in your URL bar and see that you were visiting a different page on a different site. Now it's all kind of behind many of the HTTP transactions are now completely invisible to users. And again, it's a sort of transition from pages with links to applications that exist inside of a browser. From something simple to something more robust, more complex, but also that had a, really required a kind of professionalization of the development of these online apps. One person or two people could make a website in the 1990s. Now it takes a team of programmers to do this. So there's been, in terms of artists and artist collectives working with the internet in interesting ways, it's still out there and it's still real, but it's very much on the scale of sort of, very low budget independent films versus Hollywood in terms of the main thrust of the internet that most people experience today. And it's very, very rare to find yourself on the homepage of the Lux Art Institute, right? Much more common to find yourself in your daily meanderings around the web, doing things that you need to do or required to do, like order food or go to work. So it's a very, very different web than we had then. And of course, 2007, along came the iPhone. We were teaching mobile programming and the design of web apps for phones, mobile phone apps, before the iPhone in the art department at UC San Diego, with some older Java technologies that used to run on much less capable phones. But Apple really did put together, the app for the touch interface and changed the nature of communication, and really starting with the iPhone in 2007. And this was another big impetus away from pages and toward applications that, required a great deal of professionalization to even produce the application. We started to think, instead of the internet as a thing, we started thinking of ecosystems like the Apple ecosystem or the Google ecosystem. And, a lot of our consumer choices are about what ecosystem you want to be part of today. So there's actually much less choice, much less sort of freedom in the marketplace compared to that early do-it-yourself era of the internet, where a lot of really, really interesting things happened online. This was an awkward image, but describing the more open nature of interconnectedness between people that happened on the internet before the siloization of everything. So we can look at some of the early works from this era. Alexei Shulgin is a really interesting artist and a kind person and a somebody who's lovely to interact with. And he had been working in Moscow as a photographer starting in the late 1980s. And by 1994, as the internet sort of arrived in for the first time, along with the rest of us. I mean, it's really interesting that the World Wide Web, the internet's much older than that. It goes back to 1969, but the World Wide Web as one use of the internet really became very popular and was introduced to the world at around the time the Soviet Union was dissolving and the Eastern Bloc nations were becoming freer countries. And I think for a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe, including Russia, they actually had a kind of psychological advantage in terms of exploring the early internet. And you see that a lot of this work, a lot of the really important early network kind of artwork making using the web and the form of the web really comes out of Eastern Europe, because these people were suddenly able to went from being closed and very limited in even who they could communicate with, to having the World Wide Web and being able to communicate with anybody anywhere. A new set of assumptions about who you can even talk to that was barely visible to us in the United States at that time. We were in a society with that already possessed free communication. There maybe wasn't as much of a focus on like, wow, this is amazing, what can we do with it? So Alexei, by 1994, had started putting some of the work of photographers, I think it was called Hot Pictures. He had developed a website that was, revealing to the world and sharing with the world, the photography scene in Moscow in the mid 1990s. And this was an example of taking, kind of offline art practices, digitizing them, and placing them on the internet. But as sort of the webmaster for that, he worked with the underlying technologies and began to see the underlying technologies of the internet as being actually potentially much more interesting than using the internet as a means of simply representing offline works. In other words, this is a formalist turn that takes place early in the development of the internet. And this site we'll take a look at, I think it's still there. Go ahead and open this up, yeah. The Form Art Competition site from 1997, what Shulgin did was he invited people from around the internet to submit web pages and designs that were only made with the parts of HTML that could be used to create form elements, as in a form you would fill out. And so it was only to use buttons and pull down menus and things like that. Oh, there's a list of everybody that was involved with it. But you can click in form, you can click some of these buttons, and this entire website is made up of checkboxes and radio buttons and text fields that you can type things in and interact with. So, this is really, for me, this is a moment of like transformation from internet as a place to represent offline art and really to exploring the internet, and in this case, sort of HTML and HTML pages in ways that would, allow us to see something or reveal something about the nature of the internet itself. It's really a nice site. You can interact with this in many different ways. Well, and in contemporary browsers, it doesn't work exactly the same or work the same. If I move this over, you can see the same site from the front page of it. And you can sort of see how buttons are rendered differently today, etc. Okay. So there's one example of 1990s art. There were also kind of more postmodern maneuvers that were made in the early history of the internet. Documenta 10, which took place in 1997, was the first to have a website, and it's really quite a beautifully done 1990s minimalist website. Actually, it's actually quite gorgeous. We'll go take a look at it. But when the exhibition was over, they changed it to another placeholder, preparing for the next Documenta to come. And what Vuk Kosick did was he basically used some tools, HTTP GET, to copy the entire website. And not only did he repost it here, we'll go take a look, without permission. Let's see if it's still there. Yes, it is. One of the things about the design of this is actually it would have been in a window more like this size at that time. So, this old website doesn't show, you would see this really as a much larger circle in the middle of the screen, but you'd enter by clicking on this image. And here was the original, copy of the Documenta 10 website. And he went a little bit further. I was the editor of a publication at this time that maintained, as was the tradition in the 90s, maintained a list of links to other sites. And because Documenta 10 was also the first exhibition to kind of include net art and network art, it was one of the links that we had on Switch, which was the critical publication of the graduate community at the Cadre Digital Media Lab in San Jose. And I was editing it at the time. And he sent me this, and I just, honestly, without thinking about it too much, said, "Oh, Document is changing its URL. Okay, I'll change the URL on our website," and sort of, became part of Vuk Kosick's project. He got us in a good way there. But anyway, so stealing a website could be art in the 1990s. Doing other things. This is a group called eToy. And this is their project Digital Hijack from 1996. And I think this is still around. And it's sort of a recreation of what the experience would have been like, illegal action, WW site. But what they did was this is really kind of one of the early, search engine jamming projects that existed. What they did was, well, first of all, just some history. There was no Google at this time. Google hadn't been invented yet. The leading search engine at the time was something called Alta Vista. So in the 1990s, you would probably go to Alta Vista rather than to Google to sort of start your daily activity of looking for stuff. And what eToy did was they began to hijack the names of popular brands at the time by doing, what today would seem like very, very simple search engine hacks. But still basically the same idea today with SEO, search engine optimization companies. This group of artists in some ways kind of invented the entire industry that exists today of search engine optimization in some senses. But you'd go to a site, you'd do a search for Porsche, you'd hit submit, and you'd come up with this list of sites. And because this algorithm worked by following the links on the internet to see how many links were already made to the Porsche website, so something that's part of Google's algorithms today, it still looks at things like that, but this was much simpler. They were able to, when you would click on that link, be redirected to the eToy website because they had tricked the search engine into redirecting the first link for Porsche to the eToy website. And it really started a big conversation at the time about, what the rights of companies are, what the rights of trademark are on the internet. And artists were right there involved in these kinds of, early internet provocations that were taking place at the time. Probably the most famous Google bomb was the George Bush Google bomb, where in 2007, you'd enter miserable failure into the internet, and you'd end up at the website of the President of the United States. And then after 2007, Google changed their algorithm a great deal to begin to adjust to these kinds of Google bombing attacks, where internet users could trick the Google engine into doing something like putting the President of the United States, whitehouse.gov, as the first result for miserable failure. And there are also these really kind of like other artists who did these really, really kind of subtle, interesting, simple pages that were reflections of what was coming and what the important issues were for the internet at that time. Heath Bunting is one of the other important artists. He's still an important artist, working during, but really, really famous for working during this era, doing all kinds of culture jamming and media hacking, and even work with telephones and public telephones and all kinds of really sorts of amazing stuff. But this is one of the web pages he made. And what he did was he took a Wired article. Wired is still around today, but they'd been reporting on technology and events in culture and technology, very, very actively, especially in the 1990s and still to this day. Had written this sort of story about him. And what he did was he took the, of course, copyrighted text of the story they wrote about him, and he went through, and every word in the article about him that had a domain, a web domain that was registered, he highlighted and simply linked that. So what this means is there was a but.com and a don't.com, asking.com, him.com, define.com, london.com, category.com. And he was kind of showing visually the way that the domain registration system was sort of privatizing language, privatizing words, so that there was a certain right to the word qualifications on the internet. And how much, and the reflection here is how much of the story that's about him is really not about him, because the words are owned by somebody else. So even a technical activity such as taking a text and linking, creating hypertext links to these words could deliver, a very, very sort of like profound reflection on what was happening to language because of the internet at that time. It was also an era of alternative browsers. This is the Iod Web Stalker, which was a piece of software that you used to be able to download. I have some screen grabs of it from times that I used it way back in the 1990s. Matthew Fuller, Colin Green, Simon Pope were the people behind this. And this was a web browser that didn't show you the web in the way that you expected to see the web. What it did was you would enter a website like this one, or a page like that one, and it would start on that site, and it would read all of the links on the first page, and it would map out to the rest of the web. So this is actually a kind of a good reflection on the interconnected web of that era. To put it in context, if you ran this against Amazon.com, you would just have one link in the middle of the page, because Amazon.com doesn't really have links away from Amazon.com. It's a silo. But this is what, you could enter a web page and you could follow the links from one page to another page to another page, and you could click on these and see some of the information that was on the sites. You could actually draw these pictures of how pages were connected to each other. This was the web. I mean, we're looking at least one representation of the topological representation of the web at that time, and you wouldn't have that today, because sites don't actually link to each other as often as they used to, well, except in the blogosphere. You could probably do some blogging things with it. There was also a lot of media jamming. This is I think Rachel Baker would consider this a minor work of hers, but I thought it was a really, really interesting one. It has to do with the fact that also in the internet in the 1990s was largely funded by pornography. So the context of internet use, really the infrastructure of the internet was primarily being funded by the most financially successful internet companies of the 1990s, which was pornography. Amazon didn't really break even until 2002, and they were among the companies to really become like the kind of first stable e-commerce enterprises on the internet. But before that, most of the new servers that were going online, most of the new fiber optic cable that was being laid to deliver the internet to people was really being funded by demand for pornography. Before that, it was funded by, mostly educational institutions. Back to 1969, of course, it was a DARPA project. It was a defense project at the beginning. Then an educational and research project, and then the project of pornography, and then now is, of course, kind of the era of e-commerce. Those are sort of the major, moving forces behind building out the internet throughout history, in order. But anyway, so it was a context of, as it still is today, a context of just a tremendous amount of pornography. And so as a feminist artist, she wanted to raise questions about this. And at irrational.org, she created this site. Let me go back. The front page was this sort of suggestive dot to dot puzzle. And you could click on these individual numbers. I believe the site is desiccated. I don't think it exists anymore. But as you clicked on, so, you have to imagine like what the use case for this is. Somebody would be searching, looking for porn. And most of the people that look for porn are men. I don't think that's controversial to say so. I mean, I know there's, I know it's, there are women in porn and porn for women, and that's all great. But she was really kind of targeting the main users of pornography and the main abusers of pornography, I guess. So they would find her website that included the promise of free porn, and then you'd get to one of the numbers, you'd get to this category, and you click on that category, and you would descend deeper and deeper into what looked like a broken website until this was the missing image icon from Netscape Navigator. So at this time in history, if a web page was poorly constructed and the web browser couldn't find the actual image, it would substitute this image. In Chrome, and it's a little bit different. Sometimes you'll see a little X with a box around it to represent this. But really, that was all the site ever offered, was the missing image. In fact, what this was sort of a media jamming experience, and it implemented a denial of male visual pleasure, in really, really interesting ways. I talked about that one. This is one of the pieces I was involved in at the time with dear colleagues, Ricardo Dominguez, who I teach with at UC San Diego. This was well before either of us landed at UC San Diego. Carmen Karasik and Stefan Ray. We, sort of on behalf of and inspired by the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico, began to implement what were kind of early versions of distributed denial of service attacks against various organizations who were opposed to the interests of the Zapatistas, which is a kind of an independence movement and self-sufficiency movement among the people of the Lancancanian jungle in southern Mexico. So what we would do was, the president of Mexico at the time, we created the site where we would invite large numbers of protesters to join us by loading the site. And this site, in turn, this was actually something called a Java applet that doesn't really exist anymore, but this frame would cause the website of the president of Mexico to be reloaded in these 3 frames along the bottom. And the idea was just to make their website so busy that their website would collapse or start to malfunction. And so this is an example actually from one of those performances in 1998. The difference between this, and it's really important to point out, between distributed denial of service attacks and the kind that we have today. And the things that we were doing in the 1990s with this include, the fact that we had protesters who were sort of intentionally donating their individual computers and their individual web browsers to a protest, versus the kind of distributed denial of service attacks that you read about in the news today, are really implemented with armies of zombies. In other words, computers that hackers have compromised without the knowledge of those computers' owners, and then are using those computers to create internet traffic to jam up other sites. We didn't do this with zombie computers. We did this with fully informed, completely aware protesters who were aware of the kind of, potentially legal risk that they were taking in protesting against the president of Mexico or the Pentagon. This was back during the Clinton administration, and the United States was providing assistance to Mexico, and thinking about the Zapatistas in terms of rebellion and putting down a rebellion. And by the way, they've been very, very successful in terms of creating their own kind of autonomous government in that era. So it's just some other things to go to. There was an early website, an early version of Lux Art Institute, if you will, that called rhizome.org. There were a lot of these things. There was also an email list called NetTime that was very important, where a lot of the communication about these kinds of, both the critical theory, the writing, the reporting on, the dissemination of information about net art was taking place on the site that was founded by Mark Tribe in the 1990s. And it is also, by the way, Mark Tribe is like the head of the MFA program at the School of the Visual Arts in New York, I believe, today. So this is a very, very sort of important gathering place for the dissemination of news and information. Here's a call for papers. I screen grabbed this way back then, but hey, look, it's Rachel Green. This is really part of a presentation that I give to students at UC San Diego, by the way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like colleagues, professionally or who are at UC San Diego. Professor Jordan Crandall in 1997 did an email list in which theorists and cultural commentators and practitioners and curators were invited to come and discuss, artistic practice in the network as it was emerging. That later turned into a book of his. We did have social media in the 1990s, but they looked like this. They were email lists where you could sign up on the list and receive all the email that was sent to one address. The Empire list is something that I'm still subscribed to today. It's a very good sort of international discussion about, theory, networks, current events having to do with, changes in information technology and the cultural changes that they're yielding. And it's a discussion list that's moderated. So I really recommend this list if you want to learn about some interesting things that are going on today from people in all parts of the world. They invite people, young scholars from all over academia, interesting artists to come in and discuss topics. So there are respondents and people can ask questions, and it's a really, really super cool list that was founded originally by Melinda Rackham. But then internet, Web 2.0 happened, and, Empire, of course, has a Facebook page, right? There was a sort of a transformation, I guess, from the purely email-based social media and into even kind of more constricted silos that I was talking about earlier. So I'll just a few things here. Right, here are some sort of themes of that earlier network era, and I have another slide here with themes of this silo era that we're in, just to compare a few things. So I'll switch back and forth. It was an open community was the focus of the early internet. Art of the internet is free. The works were free. Curatorial and critical efforts are free. now it's about closed communities, silos, groups that have, restricted membership, curated feeds, artificial intelligence control of content coming into us. Cyberspace, this place of possibility and exploration, was a focus of that early internet. Now it's much more of a kind of a mixed reality. And I'm not saying good or bad on any of this. It's just it's important that a lot of our early assumptions about what the internet could be really became something else, is my main point there. The ecstasy of communication, right? I mentioned that not only, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union became open to the former Soviet Union, republics in the former Soviet Union became open to the rest of the world, but they started to get the internet. And there was a time when communication itself was something that was wonderful and novel and new. And it turned into kind of a ubiquity of communication and a lot of loneliness in this era. Questioning and critique was important in that early internet. Now it's acceptance, right? In this era, there weren't as many, or there were no accept buttons. Now we push accept buttons constantly. It was exploration versus habituation. It was the notion of the death of the author, which is an idea from Roland Barthes. This was really, really important in the early internet, is that, really the audience, right, became more important than the author, that everybody was kind of making something together. Alexei Shulgin's early formalist form art website invited a bunch of other people to contribute to it with their HTML, right? And the site became something greater than the sum of all of its authors. Whereas today, everybody's an author, but yet people only read their own feed. We moved from the era of Andy Warhol's famous quote, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes," to, "In the future, everybody will be famous for 15 friends." Postmodern identity play, like the data body, you could, that was the era of nobody on the internet knows you're a dog. So a lot of artists played with the ambiguity and anonymity of identity on the internet in the early internet. And now it's identity reinforcement. Google wants you to use a real name. It's the control society. It's more invasively linking the data body to the real body, which were all counter to what we thought in that early internet. The early internet was anarchic, dangerous, and risky. Now it's safe. Security is number one. It's controlled by friendly dictatorships like Facebook. The early internet was about imagining a future. Now we're really obsessed with the present, right? As we should be. I mean, but I'm a news junkie. I'll admit that's my addiction. I read a damn lot of news. That's kind of what I do now, is read news and write software. That's kind of my life, and do electronics and stuff like that. Reframing of the image was really important then. Opposition to traditional representation. In other words, I mean, we can also talk about Alexei Shulgin here. I think Alexei is very, very important at this moment in history. Is moving from showing images of work on the internet or video documentation of projects on the internet. The internet itself was a medium, and there was a questioning of traditional representation. And then, today it's like the traditional image, infographics, memes, things like that. Like we've returned to a kind of traditional representation that doesn't question the nature of representation as much as it did. And the internet itself was the product. There was value in paying to get access to the internet, not because you had to buy your food or get a job, but because you wanted to, because it was an interesting place to go, right? The internet was the focus. It was the object of value. And now we're all the project, right? I mean, the product. We're all bought and sold by Facebook. We have, capitalism figured out a way to turn us into willing products that can be prostituted. Our data can be prostituted all over the internet. Now, there have been really interesting artistic responses to these. I think Hassan Alawi's Tracking Transients project is a really super important project that started in 2002. Hassan's an American, but because of his name being related to a person who was at the time a well-known terrorist, Hassan was singled out for additional surveillance by the FBI in the United States, who, he sort of was put in a position of having to prove that he wasn't a terrorist. It was obscene. This is, what our own country can do to us as individuals can frequently be just grossly obscene. And Hassan is a artist and professor and teacher of art who and well-known artist who suffered this seriously, having to report weekly to an FBI contact about his activities that they asked him to do in order to maintain his right to travel. Hassan travels a lot. He likes to go places and meet people and see art. So he wasn't going to be able to travel without reporting his location to the FBI. So as a web artist and an internet artist, he decided to, well, I'll just make this easier for them, right? And he developed this entire tracking system for himself, where using mobile devices, not only would he take pictures of where he was, and those would be automatically posted to the internet, but his mobile device would constantly point out where he was. And this was so that he could give his, that's the inspiration for this project, was to give his FBI handlers direct, instant feedback about where he was, what he was doing. I think there's a picture of every meal that he's taken since 2002 on this website, so that the FBI would know what he was eating. And so this becomes I think one of the just really kind of most important projects that takes place at the time when the internet was transitioning from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, and where the level of surveillance that, he was really reflecting on the level of surveillance that the internet was being used to implement at that time. That dial was being turned way up at that time. And so this fascinating project where he tracked himself on behalf of the FBI becomes one of the really important projects of sort of the 9/11 era. And from UC San Diego, Amy Alexander has done she's a polymath as an artist. Really an amazing artist. Who's done many different kinds of things, from musical interventions and creating new musical instruments, to net art, to surveillance installations. This is a piece of hers called Spin from 2007 that I happen to like. It was just an installation. If you happen to be walking past it, it would look at your face using computer vision, map your face to the closest rock star, and automatically edit a video for you in the style of the music videos of that particular rock star, and start playing it for you by the time you were walking past it. So it automatically turned everybody into a rock star. Okay. Just some other things. These are things that are going on today. I'm going to kind of skip over that and just talk about some other works that I think are interesting. It kind of brings up the question of where do we go, right, from here? What kind of comes after Web 2.0? And I think an awful lot of it has to do with, further exploring that penetration of technology into the human body. This is a performance by two very good friends of mine. They were actually part of Electronic Disturbance Theater with Ricardo and I as well on some different projects. But this is a piece they did together in 2010 called Slapshot that I've just always loved. This is a performance art piece, not using the internet per se, but using Arduino and other maker technologies. And what they did was they created this performance where they would slap themselves as hard as they could, but based on the power of that slap, the pain would also be transferred over electronically to the other person, who would feel the relative pain of the slap. And they would just take turns slapping each other, basically slapping themselves while electronically slapping the other. And they would perform as long as they could until the pain got to be too much for either of them, where it was just too injurious and too painful. That's when the performance was over, when they literally couldn't stand it anymore. So I mean, it's really, really, I've always liked this piece a lot because I think it represents not only the potentialities for adding technology to the body, but also for reflecting on it in interesting ways. The ability to, share experiences over a distance and things like that. I think those are relatively unexplored today. This is a project that I did trolling gun owners. I made an app that allowed anybody who downloaded the app to mark a location of concern. So for example, if you became aware that, maybe your children reported that the neighbor's children were playing with a gun, that you could go put a mark on a Google map in front of their house if you wanted to, and report that there was an unlocked or loaded or unsafe storage of firearms in that location. And, the users of this weren't really people that wanted to help improve gun safety in their neighborhoods. It was actually became very, very controversial among gun rights communities who doxed me and harassed me. And actually laws were passed in the state of New Jersey and Florida against doing this kind of thing. It's actually illegal in those states now to reveal the location of a gun using a map. Things like that. There's you can find some information about that. I don't. My idea about this and the reason that I bring it in here, I didn't really want to talk about a whole bunch of my work today, but this was just one way of thinking about the siloed era. One of the ways of addressing the silo era is to enter other people's silos, either to express difference. It could be in very friendly ways, trying to understand those silos, or to break the silos, becoming unwelcome within them. So it's kind of a trolling project that I did at one point. And this is kind of where I'll wrap up today. Is, what does the future hold? There are a lot of trends that are really important in recent years about computer art that all have to do with the internet. Most importantly, open source is winning. You maybe saw, that my desktop is neither Mac nor Windows. Happens to be Ubuntu Linux, which I know is a lot of people think is pretty white bread Linux, but actually it's a really, really good graphical user environment for using a computer. And Windows is dying. Microsoft is moving away from Windows. Windows may actually, this is my prediction, is that Windows at some point will turn into a Linux distribution. In other words, it'll use the open source Linux kernel at some point in the future because Windows itself just has too many problems. It really is a dying operating system at this point in history. Microsoft is moving on. So I mean, that's a good thing. And there are very, very many interesting open source software projects. So we can escape the hegemony of a certain kind of capitalism through open source. Open source is also a capitalist idea, but I won't get into the details about that. But open source is winning, and that's a very good thing. There are even there have been efforts to create kind of open source and free and differently governed social media. The inventor of HTTP, Tim Berners-Lee, has been working on a related project. So that's a trend. Maybe the hegemony of these web properties, maybe it can be broken up in some ways. Just if we start to make different, more healthy decisions about the properties we join. I left Facebook for good. Everybody should leave Facebook. You just need to quit Facebook. It's just shocking, actually, how unprepared Zuckerberg has been to deal with this era. It's like, he had a good idea as an undergraduate, left school. The man should have finished school. It's very, very sad what's happening over at Facebook if you've been following the story recently. There's a boycott, and he's blithely saying, well, it was reported that he said, oh, they'll come back soon enough. I mean, the arrogance, right, of Facebook is so remarkable. if nothing else, I implore everybody to leave Facebook. It's garbage. Um, Maker boards, things like the Arduino and the ESP32, that are, small computers that are programmable, that provide an electronics interface to create new kinds of objects that are connected to the internet. This is something that I teach at UCSD. We have a series of classes on electricity and how to use electricity, and then students make art projects with these largely open source programmable little boards. It's robotics and stuff like that. This has been super great. Mesh networking um, with newer technologies like LoRa, or even older technologies like 802.11. This really allows people to set up their own networks that are separate. You can make an internet for just dollars now. And it doesn't have to be connected to the rest of the internet. We can have our own internets, and they're slower, and they're with old equipment, repurposed old equipment as a very important operating system. I think the most important and interesting operating system in the world right now is called OpenWRT. I really should add that here. Pardon me. That should be in this presentation. OpenWRT is an operating system that allows, regular people, pretty close to regular people, there's some knowledge involved in it, but to make their own networks. So communities can have their own networks that are separate from the internet. And it's just interesting to think about, what would we use these internets that aren't surveilled by everybody? What would we use these for? Single board computers are part of it. There's actually an OpenWRT distribution for the Raspberry Pi. Maybe some of you have heard of the Raspberry Pi. It's a $35 single board computer, which actually now almost can function as a desktop replacement, running on the ARM operating system. It's another thing that we're doing a lot of our teaching with now. It runs a Linux operating system that's based on Debian. That used to be called Raspbian. It's now called Raspberry Pi OS. It's actually kind of great. If you're going to spend money on something, get a little Raspberry Pi kit and start to explore, because they're pretty amazing. Edge computing is a term for, without going into too much detail, that has to do with sensor networks and doing computation close to sensors. This is what I've been working with a guy by the name of Cicero Silva for the last couple of years, kind of exploring the possibilities of radio connected networks. In my case, in the desert, I'm a desert rat. And what I've been doing for the last couple of years is really building solar powered computing stations in the desert and having them communicate with each other for various purposes. Because it's edge computing is something that's very much sort of catalyzed by inexpensive computers, very inexpensive computers like the Raspberry Pi, and very inexpensive and accessible maker equipment like Arduino, like the Arduino board. These are important things. It's getting easier and easier to do the kind of computing that big industry does. Platforms like Docker, VirtualBox is kind of amazing. If you haven't played with it, it lets you very easily run different instances of operating systems on your computer. I can, for example, run Windows or Mac OS X in a window on my PC, that kind of thing. And then there's really a steep rise in do-it-yourself interest. This I see as something that is maybe the most important thing that's going on, because as this DIY interest in computing and making in general, it's not only things like 3D printers, but it's also, the ability of people to like recycle their own resin from milk bottles, and, a lot of upcycling of materials, reusing and repurposing materials, turning trash into art, of course, of which there's a long history, right? But this is all happening in newer and more interesting and high-tech ways. It's very, very old consumer routers that, kind of started the revolution in the operating system called OpenWRT. So these are all things that we're working with at UC San Diego, exploring in various ways. And you know, we're teaching students to think about these kinds of technologies as media for art making. Students in our ICAM major leave with, you know, a very, very intensive art degree, but where they happen to be using media like computing and robotics and the internet and computer programming and virtual reality, and other kinds of emerging computing platforms, radio technologies of various types, which is something that I teach. So, you know, we're really trying to gear up the next generation of artists who are going to be working with technology. You know, we hope that they're very, very informed about culture, about art, and they all also leave our majors at UC San Diego actually really fairly well prepared as information technology professionals too, which happens to have a nice side effect if they get good jobs if they don't want to stay in the art world. So that's something else that we're a little bit about. So yeah, that's what I had to share with you today. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm going to return control of the screen. I think I mentioned earlier that, you know, I'm really interested in having a conversation, and taking some questions and in learning from you. I'm not here just to teach and talk. I'm here to learn and listen. So this is the fun part. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, but we're actually out of time for
Oh,
questions. Yes, I'm so
oh,
sorry. Yeah.
I am prolix.
Yeah,
I
I
am
mean,
prolix.
it was absolutely fascinating, and I actually have a ton of questions. So, you know, I would love to have a conversation another time.
Okay, yeah. We can do that. I apologize. I didn't even, you know, my my actual my actual title is lecturer.
Yeah,
I guess talking too long is a little bit of a occupational hazard in my case, and I
it definitely is, but it
apologize.
was really, really fascinating. And like
Well,
I said,
thanks everybody for coming, and super nice to see you guys here as well.
yeah, thank you so much, Brett, for joining us today and sharing the story. And I definitely want to follow up with my questions at some
Okay.
point. So, all right, everybody, thank you so much. Next week, we have the Drag Queen Storytime doing a performance for us, and it's family friendly. So join us next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. For their performance. And everybody have a wonderful long weekend, and, you know,
Be safe out there.
yes, that. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.